You have permission. I'm giving it to you. You're allowed to break your game. Hey, I'm James, and I have two cats, Gandalf and Pippin. One isn't actually a wizard, but the other one is definitely a fool of a took. I'm here to dork out about Dungeons and Designs on Crumbling Keeps, the Dungeon Dorks. Early D&D was often reported as being unplayable by folks at the time. It was missing rules, there were things not explained, it was a bit of a mess. But that wasn't really uncommon for things coming out at the time, war games and whatnot, and especially being as it was a completely new idea, it makes sense that maybe some things weren't defined. No one doing it had any experience doing anything at that scale before. It's not going to be perfect. But most of the people that played it successfully did so because they played with folks that had played it before. And this tradition continues to today. The best way to learn Dungeons and Dragons is by playing it with somebody that already knows what they're doing. Yes, there are plenty of rule books for the game, and there have been throughout the ages, and hypothetically, as a new player, you could pick one up having never heard the game before or know anything else about it and play the game. But I think Dungeons and Dragons is as much an oral tradition as it is a written one. So much of playstyle has come down through the ages from old DMs to new players who've then become the old DMs. But back to it being largely unplayable back in the day, the gaps in the game were filled with house rules. Different clubs, different areas of the country, they all played the game a bit differently. Because of that oral tradition, who you learned from defined how you played the game and what rules you used. And then, of course, you were likely to come up with some of your own. And it was needed because, again, there were gaps. You needed to fill them with what you made up by yourself. And this continued, I would say, as late as second edition. Second edition is renowned for the massive amount of splat books it had. And these books often introduced new systems. And while all of these new systems worked with the core books, they didn't necessarily work with each other. There wasn't this big overview like we have today, where any adventure you pick up for 5e by WotC will work with any other adventure you pick up for 5e by WotC. It's a unified whole. And that wasn't true about second edition. If you wanted to use all of that material together, likely you're going to need to tweak some things or make some stuff up completely. You needed to homebrew. I don't think enough is said about the impact of Wizards of the Coast D&D. Their first edition was 3.0, later revised into 3.5. And one of the things this edition sought to do was to codify everything and make a more unified play experience so that people all over were playing not just the same game, but the same version of the game, the same style of the game. You didn't need homebrew anymore to fill those gaps. It became a haven for power gamers who wanted to win, in a sense, making the most powerful builds, but still within the rules, breaking the game by following the game. But that's not the kind of breaking the game I want you to do. See, back in the day, dungeon masters weren't just expected to run the game. They were also expected to be part game designer. Everything didn't have to work right out of the box because the DM would fix it. They would clean up that mess, which was the style with war games and whatnot at the time as well. You were expected to make variants, and these variants were shared nationwide through fan groups and zines. This is very different than the Pathfinder and the 5e of today, which has continued that third ed tradition of a unified play experience. And the language in both of those games, Pathfinder and 5e, is very exact so that you don't have to guess. It's almost like Magic the Gathering set a tone that D&D began to follow. I can't say that's necessarily because of Wizards of the Coast having both properties, but I wouldn't doubt it. But I want to give you permission to reclaim it, to reclaim homebrewing, to not just be a game master, but also to be a game designer in your own domain. Homebrew your own house rules. What happens when an attack roll equals a creature's armor class exactly? How bad can a critical one be? What would you let your characters do once per game session? What about once per campaign? What could they call on? What other things could you use inspiration for? What can you spend tons of gold on in town when you have too much for it to matter? I do have to say, Bastions in D&D 2024, kinda cool. But don't just do it with D&D. Do it with any game you play. You have permission. Do it so much you don't even recognize what you're playing anymore. And then give it a different name. Congrats. You have your own game now. Then again, you always did. Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you have any questions about anything I talked about here today or on any past episodes of Dungeon Dorks, go to crumblingkeep.com/question and ask away, or just check the link in the show notes.